And our last keynote session for today is on the topic of COVID and digitalization, how COVID accelerated digital transformation of healthcare. And our speaker for today will be online. It is Mirza Cifric, co-founder and CEO of Veritas, and he is a member of the company's board of directors. How PCR became a household word overnight. An insight into both the temporary changes and those that are here to stay, because nothing will be same. But I'm giving word to Mirza. Mirza, we're happy to have you here.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, everyone. Is everybody able to hear me okay? Is the connection good? Just want to make sure we have no technical issues.
We can hear you well.
Great, super. Thank you all. I hope everybody's safe and healthy today, and Bosnia and wherever you may be. I'm honored to accept the opportunity to speak at the summit, and I just want to make it a couple of household items here, just to make sure that this is just my own personal opinions and views on things, not that of Veritas or my employer, for that matter. And yeah, I've been asked to talk about the acceleration and digital transformation of healthcare. You know, it's been a long coming process. I have a very much an American perspective on this, being part of the healthcare system here over the last 25 plus years. And you know, being both in the biotechnology and life sciences business and participating in the overall, you know, healthcare system, I can tell you that the digital transformation has been something that's been long awaited for in the U.S. And in my opinion, the speed of that transformation is significantly accelerated over the last couple of years, mainly due to COVID. So let's talk about everybody's favorite topic, COVID. I'm not going to talk a lot about it, but let's take a look at a couple of important things as to why this has become such an important part of the conversation. And you know, when we talk about PCR in industry, you know, several years ago, it always followed with a detailed explanation what that is. But nowadays, everybody, it's a household term. People understand the difference between antigen tests and PCR tests, and it's great that awareness is increasing tremendously. I think that's very important for our children. It's important for STEM and for education, that they're seeing not just they're seeing a new window into the healthcare system. They're seeing a new window and new insight into technology, right? So PCR is one of these fundamental natural systems that we have harnessed and used across very different, it's really a tool in many ways similar to CRISPR, which is maybe the only other term that made it even faster into our psychology and in common language with gene editing. Couple of very important tools in how nature reads and writes DNA and RNA in case of COVID. And I think that's quite important and relevant. I hope that will motivate a lot of young children to get into biology, both boys and girls, and also understand and see how it can have an impact on people. Rapidly testing people and developing technologies for that could impact people around you very quickly. It is something that we are now using regularly. I just got swabbed this morning for my COVID PCR test. I've had many dozens of them over the last year and a half, 2 years almost. And I think these are very important aspects from an education point of view. At the same time, healthcare is a complicated system, and I think there's a lot of opportunities for younger generations to incorporate this cross-functional education. I'll give you some examples where I see things that have come about during the COVID out of necessity that are here to stay, but really my perspective is more on the education piece and how we can motivate the younger generations to really have a more broader view and interdisciplinary approach in how they look at healthcare opportunities. So if you're in IT, there are more opportunities in healthcare now than ever have existed. If you're a mechanical engineer or an electrical engineer, there are more opportunities now. The rapid changes that are happening in healthcare present a tremendous amount of opportunity for people. But we need to fundamentally change how we approach education because we're still very much siloed. And I hope that this, this pandemic and all of its negative effects give us an opportunity to learn some of those things and rapidly adjust and adapt to it, somewhat the way that we have done so in the world in terms of bringing testing and PCR as a very important tool for people to understand if they're exposed to COVID, if they're positive, and then be able to quarantine and take certain steps. In many cases, steps that they took on personally to avoid spread of the virus to the, at-risk populations, elderly and so forth, without necessarily having to have a physician, a doctor, tell them to do so. So this is where individuals taking personal stake using healthcare information, and I think that really will be the key driver. And if I was, in college right now and I'm thinking about opportunities after college and thinking about startups and ideas of things to do, I would be thinking about these interdisciplinary approaches and things that will forever change in healthcare and how one can bring products, how one can bring, innovation, intellectual property, and just generally excitement to the space. So starting with, COVID as an example, I just want to show a couple of things here. I looked up there's a lot of very interesting resources here, but the numbers are pretty telling. Just looked up the number of COVID tests that were done in Bosnia, and I would, if this was an open forum and I was there in person, I would ask you to raise your hands and take a wild guess on how many total tests, COVID tests were performed in Bosnia alone. But luckily the data is online, so I'm just going to play this, and I encourage you to go and take a look at it yourself. I think you'll find it both encouraging and surprising how rapidly the COVID test availability, even in Bosnia, came about. So you're looking at 2020 here going into the fall, and you can see the numbers, hundreds of thousands of tests have been already performed. So we're about a year ago here, and almost 500,000 tests were performed in Bosnia, many more in other parts of the other parts of the world. Many factors influencing that. But you can see how PCR, COVID testing, and the value and importance of personalized medicine and having the data and being personally empowered with that data to do something about it became pervasive by sequencing 500,000 people, which is, a pretty good chunk of our population. And of course, those numbers continued on even more so, clearly growing exponentially. And I think I'm just going to accelerate this for the time being, so you can see here we are at December 13th, the last data, a little over 1.4 million COVID tests performed in Bosnia. We can look at other countries for fun and take a look, but I'll just leave it at that. And this is our world data and data.org. I encourage you to go and play with it. You can look at a variety of different statistical information, but this just being an indicator of that. Overall, the nearly 1 billion COVID tests that have been performed worldwide is one part of the conversation, but as you can see, COVID has taught us to think about testing. It's taught us to think about personalized medicine, about having data to empower our own personal decisions, just on the basis of having a COVID PCR test, a test that is understood as a more accurate, more definitive gold standard compared to an antigen test, which is still useful and helpful in certain settings and situations. And so people are talking about that. But then somewhere earlier this summer, the conversation started shifting to even more scientifically specific terms around the genetic mutations of the virus and so-called strains, and the effect of different strains. And now words like Delta and Omicron are entering our, regular conversation and are top of everybody's mind. And just to give you an idea of some stats and data behind that, this is data that actually I have been following since January of 2020. And being in the genomic space and genetic sequencing space, I was quite curious about this. And I can tell you that in a database, a not-for-profit database that I'll show you in a minute, there have been over 6 million COVID genome sequences submissions to this database. What this looks like when we talk about strains. Thank you for unmuting me. What this looks like when we talk about strains and so forth is something along these lines here. So you can see a first submission here on the 26th of December coming out of Wuhan, China with the initial strain. You see submissions in Canada shortly thereafter, in Thailand and so forth. And you can see over the progression between March, June, rest of 2020, these are all the various strains and the phylogeny of the COVID RNA over that period of time. But you can even more so see what has happened in the last few months, and what has happened just starting in June of 21 and on in terms of all the various number of strains that we are able to monitor. Now, this is not a conversation about the prevalence of strain. This isn't meant to scare anybody or to talk about what strain is going to become a dominant, etc. This is just a conversation about the fact that we are sequencing now, and obviously the availability of sequencing and the technology in different places at different times is a factor that plays a big role in this. But the more important thing is, going back to STEM and education, our children, as young as my youngest one is 7, they're talking about Delta, they're talking about Omicron. What does it mean? What is a strain? What is a genetic sequence? What is RNA? What is DNA? What is PCR? These are the conversations. These are the positive aspects we can take out of this. And we are implementing them in schools. The conversations are happening at the dinner tables with families and so forth. And of course, the depth of the technology behind this is something that's also unprecedented. Worldwide, you can see the sequencing is happening in pretty much every single country around the world. And if not in that country, the positive samples are being exchanged in different places so that new strains can be identified and tracked. Here's one in Bulgaria. Here's one, I think in Slovenia, and so forth. More importantly, to produce this information, we are sequencing the positive samples, we are identifying them, we are uploading that data, we're sharing, we're building IT infrastructure, building collaborations across the board, across the world, across the borders, in order to generate something as powerful as this. So I'll leave it with that on the topic of COVID and what has happened, but I wanted to set the stage for a conversation about why is COVID accelerated the transformation of healthcare, and why are we talking about PCR, and why are we talking about strains? As you can see, mostly because we have the data to do so, and we have the ability to perform testing, and mobilize testing rapidly, just like you saw from the graph and how quickly we were able to mobilize testing in Bosnia and many other places. Now, switching back to, okay, what is the result of all of that in terms of what are the things that people are, changes that people are making in the rest of the healthcare system that's not related to COVID, but it's a consequence of that. And obviously, we all very well know that, especially at the beginning of COVID, the, the doctor told you to stay home unless you really needed urgent care, right? And in the US, that spurred a big and rapid transformation to small urgent care centers and obviously telemedicine. Um, those countries and places and healthcare systems that did not have that existing infrastructure quickly got it up and running. They got it up and running for education with Zoom classes, virtual classes, hybrid classes, and so forth. But they got it up and running relatively quickly in healthcare as well. And those aspects that once you get used to the convenience and the efficiency are the kinds of things that we've been advocating and hoping for decades in the U.S. and worldwide. To adopt more of the technology to make the process of really getting quality of care and data and so forth accessible to the consumers and people efficiently, cost efficiently, and rapidly. So here's a little bit of data. Overall number of tests, COVID tests performed in the U.S. and other places as well, over 600 million, tells you the scale at which the industry is able to adopt and marshal resources to solve a particular problem. And we're all hopeful that this kind of resource allocation can happen in solving some of the chronic diseases that we have, especially in the U.S., and they're very much prevalent worldwide as well. Things like diabetes and cardiovascular disease and so forth. But let's look at some actual numbers. So this is what happened with telehealth usage in the U.S. Since the start of the pandemic. And you can see a big spike here. Obviously, you can see that the numbers prior to really the pandemic taking hold were relatively small. This data is from McKinsey, and this data is based on the claims volume. So these are actual number of telehealth visits that are performed, and a bill was sent to an insurance company related to it, meaning that's resulted in a telehealth claim. And you can see the types of services were cardiology, dermatology, and certain subsections of medicine that are conducive to telemedicine. And of course, we had this big conversation. Well, okay, this is happening now, 70 million or 80 million telehealth, visits in April of 2020 because nobody left their house. Everybody was very much in a lockdown and quarantine. But things are going to go back to normal. Well, they really did not. They remained at a pretty high clip, and this is one of the things that's expected to remain. It's a 38x increase, and it's pretty much leveled off. I don't have the most recent data. It remains pretty high, and these are certain aspects of things that we're going to see remain. Obviously, certain things lend themselves more to telemedicine than others. But you start combining telemedicine with the ability to test and do other types of analysis at home, and you have a complete transformation happening in a couple of years' time that normally would take well over a decade. Okay, so that's the status of how we see things here. It's my own personal view on things. Time will only tell if people will default more and more back to the original. But once you have the convenience of a telehealth visit for something benign, it remains something that you probably want as a consumer, as you've gotten used to other types of convenient things that doesn't require you to drive somewhere, make an appointment, take hours out of your day to do so. But that is the state of the healthcare and sort of the business and the industry itself. Another indicator, even more important indicator for younger generations that are currently in school and being educated for the jobs and leadership positions of the future, is the investment that is happening in the digital health startups. So you can look at, this is sort of a leading indicator, investments made today in the digital health, especially for venture funding, are for things and technologies and tools that are probably not going to be on the market for another 1, 2, 3 to 5 years potentially, depending on how complex they are. But you can see that, the money has spoken. The investment has increased tremendously in terms of how much money we expect to return, an average return of 10x or 5x, however you'd like to take a look. And you're looking at a significant increase of $14.6 billion dollars in 2020 in venture funding. It was significantly higher than in the recent years, but it was already growing year over year over several years. So you can see that means that the investors are putting money behind technologies which they expect to stay, and the services which they expect to stay and to grow disproportionately more so compared to other types of services. An 83% increase in total revenue from digital health is not a number that's going away at any time soon. So then, getting a little bit more specific about what that means for in terms of what type of changes we can expect, I'll just give you a couple of very generic examples of things that we've already seen as being available, but not adopted as rapidly as we expect, but the things I think that our children are going to consider, the standard of care, very much the baseline expected standard of care. So one of the things that we've all seen every doctor do is, wear a stethoscope, a very useful tool to identify, dozens of different conditions, ailments, the status of health of a person. Doctors wear it with pride, as they should. But here's a Bluetooth version of that. And there are many out there in the market that simply allow you to have one at home, have one shipped to you, or purchase one at your local pharmacy store, and then have a telehealth service where a doctor can, perform very much a whole set of similar types of analyses that they could do with a stethoscope in their office. Another thing that I'm certainly familiar in Bosnia. My grandmother and mom and family members have been monitoring their blood pressure, but now that blood pressure data is uploaded, monitored remotely, done a lot more frequently, and frankly, once you monitor blood pressure data, you can easily also prescribe medication, provide other services, provide consultation, or ask a patient to come in for a more detailed checkup. Again, blood pressure monitors have been around, stethoscopes have been around from dawn of medicine, but we're now, these tools have been on the market and available for several years, but you're not seeing them as pervasively used as you have in 2020 and 21, and I think you will even more so going forward. Just another few examples of the types of very, very rudimentary things that are here and that are here to stay. Another example of something that I've personally tried is a continuous glucose monitor. We've all seen the glucose monitors, small finger prick ones. We've seen the cost of these technologies come down tremendously. This is a wearable patch that's applied. I've personally worn this. I don't have diabetes. I was just very curious about the data that I could gather and the changes in my blood sugar levels depending on the type of food and time of day, etc. So I wore it for several weeks, actually prior to the pandemic, and gathered a bunch of data. But certainly for anybody who's a diabetic, being able to continuously monitor this, to administer insulin or other therapies accordingly and very actively manage treatment and the disease are the types of things that are here to stay and going to significantly accelerate. And you can see the amount of revenue generated and the amount of devices being purchased skyrocketing in 21. And you can just think about this as as yourself. What would you do if you had to monitor your diabetes? How convenient is it to do it this way versus having a blood draw, a periodic blood draw, at months apart, not really seeing the complete data. This is literally monitored every second, and the data is plotted and available. And just yet another example. So what happens in the industry and in healthcare is that these types of capabilities start off being very expensive, very specialized, and then as the consumer demand grows, as the opportunity to scale grows, the individuals are demanding more convenient tools, devices, and so forth, that drives the manufacturers, engineers, software developers to bring the cost down and to make it more affordable, make it out-of-pocket affordable. Ultimately, that is and should be a goal of all of these technologies, to make it a lot more out-of-pocket affordable, so more people can simply pay for it, not expect the health insurance or national health insurance pay for it. And you can see from an education and from a STEM point of view, a device is, like the one we're just looking at, requires a whole confluence of material scientists, of software engineers, requires an entire IT infrastructure, an IT infrastructure that is compatible with the regulatory requirements of personal data protection and personal health information. It requires sharing this information with your physician, and requires support, maintenance, device manufacturing. And I hope that the lesson from all of this for our education and STEM is that we need to start thinking in a very interdisciplinary way and educating our children with this in mind, because they're seeing the opportunities and they're seeing what these devices look like. They're seeing what the impact is on their daily lives, on their parents, their grandparents, and themselves. And I hope that's going to drive a lot of ambition. These are very rudimentary examples. They're nothing special. You read about them online and so forth. What I'm the most encouraged about is the opportunities to learn about the new things that the next generation is going to come about. Obviously, in space like genetics, and in space like testing, PCR, genetic testing of human DNA or viral DNA or bacterial DNA, there's a whole set of new opportunities that are accessible to people to learn about and bring about new products, new technologies. So I hope that in speaking about this, we can educate as many people as possible about the great prospects that this is going to bring, because these will be the types of products and services that are going to be now far more rapidly accelerated. In the US, for example, even the regulatory aspect of getting a COVID test with an emergency use authorization was an unprecedented move for very rapid approval of a complex PCR test through the FDA, which was a pioneering way of getting something to market very fast, a way that that we hope will be a path for other types of products and services. And so in healthcare, there's often this notion that because of the complexity and the regulatory complexity of bringing a product to market, it's long, it takes a lot of money, it is slow. That's changed tremendously. It's changed out of necessity with COVID, and we're hope that those types of things are here to stay for many different products, ideas that we haven't even heard of yet, and ideas hopefully that will bring about much better quality of care, more data-driven and personalized medicine, and just overall better health for everyone. So I will stop here and just give you all folks as much opportunity to ask me questions as possible. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you all from Boston today.
Thank you, Mirza, for amazing presentations. And we have 10 minutes for Q&A session. So if someone has a question, you can raise your hand. You know the drill.
Hello. Hey, Mirza. Thank you for taking the time to share this with us. The question I have is that, as you already said, we are going to see huge benefits from this digitalization and digital transformation. But on the other side, what do you think, is this going to have more benefits or downsides, taking in consideration that how this is going to have a lot of psychological effect on newer and older generations, and how this will affect the countries with bad internet, let's call it literacy, and understanding of the technology itself? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, I think that inclusiveness is a big and important challenge for everyone. One that should be in the forefront of everyone's mind. Look, I mean, the cost reduction, which is often the driver and a barrier to adoption, comes with scale. And so I think that the more adoption that we see, and higher manufacturing and lower costs of producing these devices, we'll see broader adoption globally. There's also a tremendous amount of innovation that's happening in that space. If you look at something simple as an antigen test, a lateral flow test, it's been around for decades. We're now able to test for COVID antigen, and the ability to produce that is at a very large scale, very, very inexpensively, has always been there. Now it's increased, a millionfold probably. So I'm hoping that will bring about all kinds of other testing and improvement in innovation in the sensitivity and specificity of those tests and the technology that's used there. That's an example of it. Ultimately, the accessibility, and ultimately that will solve the product piece of it. The services and education, just as importantly around that, the value and importance of testing and how to interpret a test. Innovation has sort of an uncanny way of continuing to find problems and solve them. A lateral flow test is pretty easy to read for anybody without a computer, without even a phone. But I think as confluence of adoption of mobile technology and then the technologies like were described here will actually bring about greater opportunities. You can talk about a very remote places, as long as there's a cell phone connection, and there is in many of these places. One person can probably administer, healthcare services remotely to hundreds, if not thousands of people. So yes, it will be a big challenge. It's a challenge incumbent on all of us to be inclusive of as much as possible, especially the underserved and underprivileged populations, because we are equally, if not more, affected in those parts of the world by the lack of services and the technology. So I'm with you 100%, but I'm very hopeful that that's a challenge that we are going to be able to solve.
Thank you, Mirza, for your answer. Do we have more questions here? It seems like to be end, but I believe they need some time to chew this presentation, and I will be free to say to them that they can reach out to you on LinkedIn and ask if they have any questions. It's so strange to giving you to turn your back and speak about you. So with Mirza, please you want more applause for Mirza.